All right, let's not waste any time. The resurrection of Jesus is one of the most debated events in history. Think about this for a moment. What would it take to convince billions of people over 2 millennia that a man came back from the dead? We're not just talking about a small group of people trying to push a story. No, this is a belief that has reshaped entire civilizations, inspired revolutions, and continues to fuel billions of lives today. But here's the catch: is there any actual historical evidence for it? Not just religious belief, real, tangible, undeniable evidence? Today we're diving into 3 key historical facts that prove the resurrection of Jesus. And trust me, these aren't just claims from people who already believe they're facts that even skeptical historians agree on. The first one, the empty tomb. Now, you might be thinking, what's so special about an empty tomb? Couldn't it have been tampered with? And that's a fair point. But let's break it down. History records that after Jesus was crucified, his body was placed in a tomb owned by a man named Joseph of Arimathea. This wasn't some hidden grave in the middle of nowhere. It was a known tomb, sealed with a massive stone and guarded by Roman soldiers. In other words, this was not some random, forgettable burial site. Yet, just days later, the tomb was empty. That's a fact that even critics of Christianity agree on. Why? Because if the tomb wasn't empty, Jesus' critics, the Jewish leaders, and the Roman authorities could have easily produced his body to shut down the entire movement before it even started. But they didn't. Why? And here's where it gets even more interesting. You've got to consider who first discovered the empty tomb: women. Now, in the culture of that time, women weren't exactly considered reliable witnesses.
Click subscribe to this channel to get more topics you love.
If you were making up a story in the 1st century, you'd never have women as your star witnesses. It'd be like trying to sell a groundbreaking scientific discovery today by saying, "My cat confirmed it." It just wouldn't hold weight in the culture of the time. So why would the early Christians claim that women found the empty tomb? Because it actually happened. They weren't trying to make the story more convincing, they were just telling the truth, even when it was inconvenient for them. Now, I know what you're thinking. Couldn't the disciples have just stolen the body? That theory has been around for centuries, but let's be real here. These were terrified, scattered men who had just seen their leader brutally executed. Do you really think they'd risk their lives to break into a tomb guarded by Roman soldiers, steal a body, and then go on to proclaim a resurrection they knew was fake while being persecuted, beaten, and even killed for it? Let me ask you something. Would you be willing to die for something you knew was a lie? Not something you believed in, but something you knew for a fact was false? Because that's what you'd have to believe if you think the disciples stole the body. And let's not forget the Roman guards. These weren't amateurs. They were professional soldiers, trained to follow orders and protect that tomb with their lives. If they failed, they could be executed. Do you really think they'd just let a ragtag group of fishermen overpower them? But here's where it gets even crazier. The empty tomb wasn't just a claim made by Jesus' followers. Even the Jewish leaders acknowledged it. They didn't deny that the tomb was empty, they just tried to explain it away by saying the disciples stole the body. But as we've already seen, that explanation falls apart under scrutiny. So let's sum this up. The empty tomb is a historical fact. It's not just a claim made by Christians, it's something that even critics of Christianity agree on. And the implications are massive. If the tomb was empty, then the question we have to ask is what happened to Jesus' body? All right, so now we've established the first fact, the empty tomb. But an empty tomb by itself doesn't prove a resurrection, does it? It just proves that the body wasn't there. That leads us to the second historical fact, that even skeptics agree on the testimony of eyewitnesses. Now let's think about this carefully. If you're claiming someone rose from the dead, it's not enough to say the tomb was empty. You need witnesses, people who actually saw the resurrected Jesus. And here's where things get wild. The historical accounts tell us that Jesus didn't just appear to one person or two people in some dark corner where no one else could verify it. No, he appeared to hundreds of people in multiple locations over a period of 40 days. Let me hit you with one of the most compelling pieces of evidence. In 1 Corinthians 15, the Apostle Paul writes about the resurrection, and he lists the people who saw Jesus alive after his death. He mentions Peter, the other disciples, and then says Jesus appeared to more than 500 people at once, many of whom were still alive at the time Paul was writing. Now, why does that matter? Because Paul was essentially saying, if you don't believe me, go ask them. He wasn't writing this decades or centuries after the fact. He was writing it during the lifetime of the eyewitnesses. If he was lying, it would have been incredibly easy for people to call him out. But we have no record of anyone successfully refuting it. And it's not just Christians who acknowledge this. Even skeptical historians like Bart Ehrman, who doesn't believe in the resurrection, agree that the disciples were absolutely convinced they had seen Jesus alive after his death. Let me repeat that even critics agree that the disciples genuinely believed they had seen the risen Jesus. Now, that raises a huge question. What could have caused these people to have such a firm, unshakable belief that Jesus was alive? And we're not just talking about a few people here. Remember, the disciples were terrified after Jesus was crucified. They scattered, they hid, they were in despair. But something happened that turned them into bold, fearless witnesses who were willing to face imprisonment, torture, and even death because they were so convinced that Jesus had risen. Here's the kicker: people don't willingly die for something they know is a lie. Sure, people might die for something they believe is true, even if it's not. But the disciples weren't claiming to believe in some abstract idea. They were claiming to be eyewitnesses. They were saying, I have seen Jesus alive with my own eyes. If they were lying, if they had made the whole thing up, they would have known it was a hoax. And yet, history tells us that many of them went to their deaths rather than deny what they had seen. Think about Peter, for example. He was so scared on the night of Jesus' arrest that he denied even knowing him not once, but 3 times. Fast forward a few weeks, and Peter is standing in front of a crowd in Jerusalem, boldly proclaiming that Jesus has risen from the dead. What could cause such a dramatic transformation? Or take James, the brother of Jesus. During Jesus' ministry, James didn't believe that Jesus was the Messiah. Imagine how hard it would be to convince your own sibling that you're the Son of God. Yet, after the resurrection, James became a leader in the early church and was eventually killed for his faith. What could possibly convince someone to die for the belief that their brother was God in the flesh? And let's not forget Paul. He wasn't just a skeptic, he was an outright enemy of Christianity. He was actively hunting down Christians, trying to destroy the movement. But then something happened. Paul claimed that he encountered the risen Jesus, and that encounter completely flipped his life upside down. He went from being a persecutor of Christians to one of the most passionate and influential leaders of the early church. Now, here's a question for you. How do you explain these transformations? What could cause people like Peter, James, and Paul to go from fear, doubt, and hostility to bold, unwavering faith. Some people argue that the disciples were just hallucinating, but that theory doesn't hold up under scrutiny. Hallucinations are typically individual experiences. They don't happen to groups of people at the same time. Yet, as we've already mentioned, Jesus appeared to over 500 people at once. Are we supposed to believe that all of them had the exact same hallucination at the exact same time? That's not how hallucinations work. Others suggest the disciples were simply lying. But again, why would they do that? What would they gain? They weren't getting rich or powerful because of their message. In fact, they were facing persecution, poverty, and death. If they were lying, they had every reason to give up and save themselves. But they didn't. And let's not overlook the diversity of the eyewitnesses. Jesus didn't just appear to his closest friends and followers. He appeared to skeptics like James and enemies like Paul. He appeared to individuals and groups, indoors and outdoors, in the city and in the countryside. The sheer variety of these appearances makes it incredibly difficult to dismiss them as mere fabrications or psychological phenomena. So here's where we're at. The testimony of the eyewitnesses is not something you can just brush off. These were real people who genuinely believed they had encountered the risen Jesus, and their lives and deaths are a testament to the power of that belief. Now, let me ask you, if you were one of those eyewitnesses, what would it take for you to risk everything, your reputation, your safety, your life, to proclaim that Jesus had risen? Could you do it if you didn't absolutely believe it was true? All right, so far we've covered two undeniable historical facts: the empty tomb and the testimony of eyewitnesses. But there's one more fact we need to talk about, and it's perhaps the most remarkable of all: the explosive growth of the early church. Think about this for a second. How does a small group of mostly uneducated, marginalized people, following a crucified leader, end up creating a movement that transforms the entire Roman Empire in just a few centuries? Let's set the stage. Jesus was executed as a criminal. Crucifixion wasn't just a form of execution, it was a statement. It was Rome's way of saying, this person is a failure, a fraud, and an enemy of the state. In the ancient world, dying on a cross was the ultimate symbol of shame. So how in the world do you go from that to millions of people worshiping this man as the Son of God? Here's the key: the message of the early Christians wasn't just about Jesus' teachings or his moral example. It wasn't, hey, follow this great teacher who had some inspiring ideas. No, the message was centered on one thing: the resurrection. The claim that Jesus had risen from the dead wasn't just a side note, it was the foundation of everything they believed and preached. Now, here's the crazy part. If the resurrection didn't actually happen, the early Christian movement would have collapsed before it even began. Why? Because they were making a claim that could be easily disproved. Remember, they were preaching this message in Jerusalem, the very city where Jesus had been crucified and buried. If the resurrection was a lie, all the authorities had to do was produce Jesus' body, show the corpse, and the entire movement is over. But they couldn't. And it wasn't just the message that was unusual, it was the people spreading it. These weren't powerful, influential leaders. They were ordinary men and women, many of whom had been fishermen, tax collectors, or outcasts. Yet, despite their lack of resources, education, or social status, they were able to spread their message across the known world. Now, let's pause here for a second. You've probably heard people say, well, lots of religions start small and grow over time. What makes Christianity any different? Fair question. But here's the thing: most religious movements grow because they align with the culture they're in. They offer something that fits with the existing beliefs or values of the people. Christianity did the exact opposite. It was completely countercultural. The idea that a crucified man could be the savior of the world was absurd to both Jews and Gentiles. For the Jews, the Messiah was supposed to be a conquering king, not someone who died a shameful death. For the Gentiles, the idea of a bodily resurrection was ridiculous. Greek philosophy taught that the physical body was something to be escaped, not something to be raised and redeemed. And yet, despite all of this, Christianity didn't just survive, it exploded. By the end of the 1st century, there were Christian communities in major cities across the Roman Empire. By the 3rd century, it was one of the most influential movements in the empire. And by the 4th century, it became the official religion of Rome. So what caused this explosion? Let's think logically. Movements like this don't just happen because of good ideas or charismatic leaders. Something had to ignite it. And that something was the conviction that Jesus had risen from the dead. Let me hit you with another question: why would people join a movement that guaranteed them persecution? Because that's exactly what Christianity offered in its early days. To be a Christian in the Roman Empire often meant risking your reputation, your safety, and even your life. The Roman authorities saw Christianity as a threat, and the Jewish leaders saw it as blasphemy. Christians were imprisoned, beaten, tortured, and killed for their beliefs. So why did they keep coming? Why did the movement grow instead of die? What would make someone say, "Yes, I'm willing to risk everything to follow this crucified man"? Here's the answer: they genuinely believed that Jesus had risen from the dead. And not just the original disciples. This belief spread to thousands of people who had never even met Jesus during his earthly life. The resurrection wasn't just a story they'd heard, it was something they believed was real, because the eyewitnesses were still alive, sharing their testimony. And let's talk about the power of the message itself. The resurrection wasn't just a claim about what happened to Jesus, it was a promise of what could happen to anyone who believed in him. The early Christians didn't just preach that Jesus rose from the dead. They preached that his resurrection was proof that death itself had been defeated. That forgiveness, hope, and eternal life were available to everyone, no matter their background or status. This message resonated deeply with people who were living in a world filled with suffering, injustice, and fear. It gave them a hope that was bigger than anything the Roman Empire or any other power could offer. But let's not overlook the practical side of this. The early Christians didn't just talk about love and hope, they lived it. They cared for the sick, fed the hungry, and welcomed outsiders. They created communities where people of all races, classes, and genders were treated as equals. These weren't just words, they were actions that backed up their beliefs. And here's something to think about: if the resurrection was a lie, why would the early Christians go to such lengths to build a movement that was so radically selfless and sacrificial? Most lies are told for selfish reasons: money, power, fame. But the early Christians gained none of that. In fact, they often lost everything. So here's the bottom line: the explosive growth of the early church is something that demands an explanation. And the simplest, most logical explanation is this: the resurrection of Jesus actually happened. Now, let me ask you something. If you were living in the 1st century, surrounded by persecution and hostility, would you risk everything to follow a lie? Or would you need to be absolutely convinced that what you believed was true? And here's the bigger question for us today: if the resurrection is true, what does that mean for you? What does it mean for your life, your choices, your future? Because if Jesus really rose from the dead, then everything changes. The empty tomb, the eyewitness testimony, the unstoppable growth of the early church. These aren't just random events, they're pieces of a puzzle that, when put together, point to one undeniable truth: Jesus rose from the dead. His resurrection isn't just a historical fact, it's an invitation to hope, an invitation to life, an invitation to a relationship with the God who loves you so much that he was willing to conquer death itself. Now, the question is, what will you do with this? Will you ignore it, dismiss it, or will you take a closer look and see where the evidence leads? This is the story that has changed billions of lives, including mine. And it can change yours too. But only if you're willing to ask the question, what if it's true? Thank you for watching. And remember, truth has a way of finding you, no matter where you are.